Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Doug Abdiel, who is the Global Vice President of Customer Experience and Support at Advanced Navigation, where he leads an engineering team focused on integrating cutting-edge navigation and robotics technologies directly with end users. With deep expertise in maritime and aerospace systems, Doug specializes in developing resilient solutions for GPS-denied environments, a critical capability in the modern information and electronic warfare landscape. He is currently engaged in high-stakes operational work in Ukraine and across the globe, collaborating with international defense leaders to translate field lessons into robust technology roadmaps that bridge the gap between advanced research and practical national security operations. Doug has over two decades of experience as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, which include deployments to Haiti and Afghanistan. And just as a preface here, Doug's opinions are his own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the U.S. Department of War, the Department of the Navy, nor the U.S. Marine Corps. All right, Doug Abdiel, welcome back to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much, John. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, likewise. And so the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Doug, will cover what you are calling the new fog of war, navigating through GPS-denied and degraded environments. And by the way, shout out, and there's a link in the show notes to a previous episode, recent episode with Bugsy Segal on Ukraine, electronic warfare, and fast battlefield innovation. And to our audience, Doug hit me up and said, "Oh, wow, that's an awesome discussion with Bugsy a couple of weeks ago. I would love to offer some of my observations as well." So that is what we are doing now. But before we get into this topic too deeply, Doug, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I was really struck by a recent trip to Ukraine with General Petraeus just a couple of weeks ago. He serves as an advisor to our board and obviously has worn multiple hats. I think John and I both served under him in Afghanistan. I think we were there at the same time. He's obviously a brilliant thinker. So I'd just like to borrow his quote and his brilliance for a second. And fundamentally, his view is that Ukraine is currently the proving ground for the rest of the world about what the future of warfare is looking like. And what we're seeing there is not a interesting but irrelevant battlefield, but in fact a future view of it. And his mental analogy is, again, just fully ripping off him, but at least I'm going to give attribution. He's like, would you like to go? Would you like to have the team that plays scrimmages half a dozen times a year, or the one that goes to the Super Bowl every single day? And do you want to go to war with them? And he and we are trying to get insights from the current battlefield in Ukraine to try and make sure that the United States and its allies are well protected going forward. And I think to follow on really from what Bugsy was saying in the previous podcast, it caused me to reach out to you. I just couldn't echo that more than what Bugsy was saying. By keeping us off of that battlefield, we are ignoring insights that could save future generations of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen's lives.
Yeah, that's a good take on that for sure. So I really like how we're kind of like touchstone back to Clausewitz on this, and uh, uh, bringing up the fog of war. So how has and we're going to be talking about GPS and navigation. So, how has the transition from earlier forms of navigation, like and literal fog and smoke on the battlefield, and friction with maps, and celestial and compass matters, and total reliance on GPS, how is this changing the way a modern warfighter perceives ground truth today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, from my perspective, I don't know what it was like for you before you deployed, but I went to REI and I got a scratch and dent GPS, handheld GPS as a redundant version and clipped it on my chest rig so that I was still going to be able to do call for fire even if my plugger was down or I wasn't able to get on my BFT. And I, like you, did the 1 to 50,000 and a lensatic compass in, the hills of Quantico trying to figure out how to navigate around. But then we didn't really use that except as a fallback. And we got really accustomed to, probably since the first Gulf War, just depending on everything above us working, us getting an accurate position of where we are. I remember hearing an anecdote from the first Gulf War where one of the Iraqi generals came out after Stormin' Norman did his really famous left hook through the desert and asking, where did you come from? And like, oh, we came through
Mm,
that desert over there. And like, no, that's impossible. You couldn't come from there because no one can navigate through that desert, because that was the
mm,
first time that GPS had ever been really used in combat at scale. And
mhm,
from my perspective, we are now in an environment, we're seeing it with the Russians and Ukrainians today, that they can now impose fog, and it was interesting
mm,
that Clausewitz mentioned this, like it shaded the battlefield, that smoke and that dust that you got on the battlefield where you used to have people with trumpets direct you around and try and keep the units in
mm,
formation. Well, we're going to run into the same problems with positioning data, with navigation, and with timing. That's really important to make sure that we're synchronizing, our call for fires from air and our call for fires from IDF, and even some of our cognitive fires to make sure we get the biggest strategic effect on the enemy by hitting them by multiple
mhm,
means. So I think from my perspective, we really need to have a bottoms up thought with all the points of dot mil PF, starting all the way back at doctrine, saying, okay, let's look at this from first principles. What is that commander going to
mhm.
be able to rely on the battlefield in terms of where is he pointing, where are his adjacent units, and where are the enemy units? We've gotten really accustomed to having a God's eye view on this in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't believe that's reflective of the future of warfare.
Yeah, yeah. I think you mentioned this briefly, but we've in Western societies have become accustomed to GPS as just being always there, right? It just is. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, hey, that's great. It's glorious. I mean, it's been a tremendous advancement and uh, helps a lot of people for sure. But uh, that over reliance on GPS is also a little bit of an Achilles heel. And so we had a little pregame before hitting record, and I mentioned DoD probably 6, 7, 8 years ago came out with a call for proposals on things like redundancy and communications. And I just remember so distinctly this call for proposals that they were asking for like new technologies that can basically do celestial navigation in case GPS becomes compromised. Well, here we are. And by the way, we're recording this in the middle of February of 2026. And here we are. Compromised GPS is not just like, yeah, maybe someday. We need to at least plan for the possibility that GPS might not be around or function the way we've been accustomed to it doing. Um, but now, I mean, it is reality. So I'm curious, Doug, if you could just kind of riff on that a little bit. But from an IO perspective, how has this this navigational strength become a major vulnerability in your opinion?
Yeah. So again, I think Bugsy briefly talked on this on his episode a couple of years ago. Just from a very straightforward perspective, it is nearly impossible for the Russian Federation to launch drones into Ukraine or vice versa um, without experiencing complete loss or degradation of their GPS. We call them GNSS because it pulls in all kinds of different constellations. Um, uh, and that is important because, as you know, you can't conduct maneuver warfare very effectively without having that third level, that air cover. When we started to get
Mm,
some breakthroughs in the Second World War, it was because we were able to bring together um, air and maritime and land assets all at the same time and maneuver them together intelligently and effectively. And we only amped that up in the first Gulf War, and we saw the devastating effects of that as well in the second march to Baghdad and in our insertions into Camp Rhino and in South
mm,
Helmand. I'm sorry, into Kandahar.
mm, mm, mm,
And now, yeah, look, we just cannot depend on it anymore in the same way. You can depend on perhaps two things: either it's not going to exist, or the data that it's going to give you is going to be wrong if you're facing a near peer adversary. And just as you regular people may be trying to leave a tunnel and trying to get the right lane when you're inside of a tunnel in a car, or you're going through a big city and you find yourself one street over, or it tells you you're one street over when you're one street on the other side, the same
mm,
effects happen on the battlefield, right? Except you pay the cost for those effects in lives lost
mm,
rather
mm.
than in just being a little delayed on your trip. And that's the overall purpose here: is how do we save the lives of the good guys and make sure that they know where they are.
Right. So, how exactly does this work? How are these attacks being conducted? I'm using GPS, or I would like to know where I am and where I need to go, and uh, something's not working right. But how are they actually affecting the
Yeah.
GPS and the way it gets interpreted?
Yeah, good question. So, look, I'm going to talk about what's happening right now. There's two broad classifications of attacks that are happening to GPS or GNSS. First of these is just jamming, and you can think of that like um, you you are trying to hear something in a very crowded room, and you have somebody just come into that room and make all kinds of noise, just yelling, just shouting, that kind of stuff, and you
Mm,
can't hear the person who you're trying to talk to. It's like sitting in that crowded restaurant and you just got to lean closer and closer in, and as I get
mm,
older that gets harder and harder and I got to lean tighter in. um, that's jamming. In one way, that's kind of a useful attack because it lets you know that somebody is there. You can tell when that's happening. You know when it's
mm,
noisy, when it should
mhm,
be quiet, right? The more insidious version of this is if you imagine that you were, um, in that there's some of those restaurants for people who can't see. You can dine in the dark, I think is what they're called. You can sit around and
Oh,
all
is
have
that right?
dinner, and the
Huh.
servers are all people who are blind, and they'll come and serve you. But now imagine that you had somebody in that environment who comes up and pretends that they're your server,
Mm,
that they're going to serve you food. And they say, oh, okay, well, here's what's on the menu, what have you. Or more insidiously, they come up after you're done with your meal and they say, okay, it's time for you to pay. Just hand over your credit card here and I'll tap it on this machine and you'll be ready to go. And then you tap your credit card and you're like, oh, wait. And your real server comes back just after that and says, hi, are you ready to pay
it's,
for your
are you
bill?
ready to pay
Oh, no,
now?
no, sorry, what? Excuse me, I just paid the other guy, right? So we talk about this kind of like whispering lies, right? So you're in that environment with lots of other signals, and you have somebody come up and they pretend that they are your server. They are the right person that you should think of as
Mm,
authoritative in that environment.
mm.
And there's lots of specific ways that we can get into them doing it. But that's the broad categorization of the two different types of attacks that we run into.
Huh. First of all, I've never heard of those restaurants before. That's really interesting. I'll have to try to check that out sometime. But the first kind of an attack, you said, well, it's not good, but at least you know that something funny is going on. But I would assume that attribution might still be a challenge unless you know you've just got one adversary, and it's got to be that adversary. But then the second one is really insidious.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're quite right. It's not in a just peer on peer conflict. You can basically assume who it is, and it's actually not incredibly difficult to even know where it is because you have to just you basically put out just a bunch of power
Mm,
into that component of the electromagnetic spectrum so that it can't it overpowers all the other stuff that's in there. So it'd be just like that restaurant again, somebody walking in and just screaming at the top of their lungs. You know who's doing it, but it, it doesn't really help you understand the conversation from the guy across the table because he's still screaming at the top of his lungs, and you can't really, unless you want to tackle the guy, which we know we
yeah,
can direction find folks, and that's another component of electronic warfare that broadly fits into this cognitive area. Certainly, counter battery fire and keeping those um, the or trying to disable those jamming nodes is important. But yeah, you're quite right. That second one is particularly insidious
yeah.
and can get you from a cognitive perspective doing things you shouldn't be doing, like the mental analogy of paying your credit card bill to somebody you shouldn't.
Right, right. Well, let's continue. Can you continue down that cognitive line? And yeah, so how does this, manifest in battlefield effects where, getting into a commander's OODA loop? How have you seen that happening, or maybe people successfully, countering that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when John Boyd talked about the observe, orient, decide, act loop, when he talked about orient, what he really said was, look, you've got to put yourself on a map. You've got to visualize where you are relative to your opponent, and where this really cuts is when you're trying to orient. You're getting data in and you're
Hmm.
assuming that you can place yourself on a mental map relative to your opponent, and that's just fundamentally flawed. And what are the real implications of this? We can go into some of the details on some of the attacks a bit later. But fundamentally, if you think you're supposed to be, you know, 300 yards left and you're 300 yards right, and you are a cruise missile, right? You're gonna be off target. Right? You're going to fundamentally miss your mission. Or perhaps even worse, imagine you are that medevac that's trying to come in to pull somebody out, and you're told the LZ is in one place, and you get run into a grove of trees, and it's the middle of the night because you can't find that LZ, and you can't find that you know Marine that's sitting there with a NATO Y and a spinning buzzsaw because your primary means of navigation has actually been your GPS, and you're only trying to get down to that fine point at the end, and you can't find him because it keeps telling you that you're 3 clicks off, 4 clicks off. Right? You can have real physical battlefield effects that can um, endanger service members by virtue of not having the right data about where you are.
Yeah. I think this might be a good time to talk a little bit about the work you and your colleagues are doing at Advanced Navigation, and talk about inertial based ways of addressing this problem.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I'll try and stay at a pretty high level here. I'm happy to
Hmm.
nerd out with you later on, John, if you really like it.
Yeah.
But I'm start
Okay.
real fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what do we mean by inertia? Simply, this is what one of Newton's laws of motion. Objects that are at rest tend to stay at rest. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion, right? And you inside of your head have a little inertial sensor. In fact, you have three of them. It's called your vestibular system, and we basically have a digital version of that. You, as you know, when you're on a merry-go-round and you get spinning on that thing and then you stop and that fluid in your inner ear keeps spinning, well, you feel dizzy because you end up with this mismatch between your vestibular system and your eyes, and your body can't figure out what you're
Hmm.
aiming to do, right? But inside of there, what you've got is three axes of movement in the inside of your ear. One that tells you when your head is twisting left and right, one that tells you when your head is twisting up and down, and one that tells you when you're twisting your head shoulder to shoulder, right? It measures nothing other than inertia. It
Hmm.
it figures out how quickly the fluid in your ear moves relative to what it was doing before. What it can't do is um, what some of our systems can do, which is, as you know, John, we're all on a spinning Earth, right? We're all
Hmm. Hmm.
moving several thousand miles per hour in order to be able to complete the circuit of the Earth, and then that Earth is then spinning around the sun. Well, our systems, I don't want to give too much away here, but they're sensitive enough that they can even measure things like the spin of the Earth. That
Hmm.
system is able to determine, okay, I I can, if I know that I'm stationary, I can determine, well, one, which way is up because I can sense a bit of gravity. I can feel that pulling down on
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
And then I can sense the spin of the earth because I've got these cool, what are called lasering fiber optic gyroscopes that can determine how quickly that earth is spinning. And then I can fuse that together and get you kind of a much more amped up version of you walking around in a room with your eyes closed or walking around in the dark. You're not totally helpless when you get into a room and the light switch is on the other side of the room or the lamp is on the other side of the room, right? You can
Hmm.
navigate for a little bit in the dark. Well, that's basically what we're doing here. We're able to fill in all the data in between when you have absolute position, just using kind of an amped up version of what's inside your ear, if that makes sense.
Wow. Holy cow. So, um, that's really cool. So, uh, I, as I'm sitting on the earth right now, I have, yeah, I guess based off of your description, between the various different vectors that can be calculated as far as where I am on the earth and where the earth is in relation to maybe the sun or something, you can assign a precise point for me currently. And then if I want to go, across town, that point also has like a unique address, I guess, based off of this kind of inertial based logic. And then you can navigate from one to the next because every point in between has the same kind of a unique address or something like that. Is that at all close?
Okay, so what you just described there, John, is perfectly plausible. If you had the data about um, rotation from multiple points, you could do that. It's theoretically possible. So, for instance, again, if you took that vestibular system and you put yourself on the top of the earth and you instantaneously were able to sense that motion in your inner ear, well, then if you were looking down from the top of the earth, the earth would be spinning clockwise. And you could theoretically measure just the movement in that little arc in your vestibular organ in your ear. And that could tell you, oh, you're spinning this direction, you must be at the North Pole because I only sense it spinning in this direction and not in any other dimension. Now, conversely, if you took yourself to the equator and your inner ear didn't feel any of that, and all you felt was this sudden jerk of speed and a bunch of spinning in the axis that looked like your head was tilting up and down, then and presuming you were facing towards east or west, well, then you could tell that you were at the equator. You could theoretically do that, and you could theoretically interpolate between these points. The trouble is just the sensitivity you've got to get to. Like our machines are able to detect the change in the speed of light um, at 15 degrees per hour. And that the level of sensitivity required to do what you're describing is even harder than that. I won't go into
Mm.
exactly
Hmm. Hmm.
how the tangents get cut, but what it requires is fusion of our sensors and often a bit of additional data. So what we tend to do is grab some data about where we are from GNSS or from celestial navigation or from magnetometers or what have you, and then we fuse them together. And our
Mm.
view is that um, inertial is a great core because it really can't be tampered with because it
Hmm.
doesn't depend on, you know, if, for instance, you were depending on a compass, if you come up next to that compass with a big electromagnet, or you run, pilots will tell you this, if you run right next to something that's got a lot of iron ore, your compass will slew. But
Mhm.
inertial is all internal.
Right. I mean, even my understanding is that in the space domain, um, in low Earth orbit in particular, but other orbital regimes as well, when satellites pass over huge mountain ranges like the Himalayas, it creates like a gravity well.
That's
I,
exactly right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So these physics matters.
It
And so,
turns out. It
yeah,
turns
yeah,
out.
it turns out, the laws of physics work even at distance or proximity, like you were just describing with compass spoofing. So, you were sharing with me, and I think the audience would be interested to know as well at Advanced Navigation that y'all's technology comes with electronic protection capabilities. Could you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. So look, we're still learning on this, and we consider ourselves to be in kind of permanent beta, as we would have called it at
Hmm.
Google. Um, we we tend to partner with companies and governments who are struggling with this, and then we learn through putting ourselves through some of the most difficult environments what works and what's practical. So I'm gonna maybe I'll just try and divide this up into um, physical, electromagnetic, and then data indicators, and talk through kind of what we do briefly at those levels, and then what we can do to counter this. This all requires a lot more time than we have here today, but I'll just briefly run through them. So from a
Hmm.
physical perspective, well, it turns out that to jam a GPS unit, you have to put out a lot of power. Just like that guy in the restaurant there, if he was screaming all night, he'd get tired, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
well, so one thing that means is it's very difficult for this to actually be airborne. They become big
mm,
targets, and it's difficult to feed them enough power. So they tend to be landborne. So one simple thing that we can do is make sure that the antennas that we have are shaped in such a way that they um, only receive signals from a high angle, and they'll disregard all the signals from a lower angle. So you can still have a really good, relatively low cost antenna that rejects all that physical data that says you're down low. Why does that matter? Well, if you're up in an aircraft and you know that the jammer is going to be on the ground, well, then you can just forget about anything that you get coming from the ground, right? That's a physical protection,
mm,
just as one example. Other things that we can do is, we can look at the actual electromagnetic spectrum and figure out, is this um, is this too high powered? Well, if it's too high powered, maybe we can just reject it. Is it just a little bit off of time in one way, or is it a bit too wide? Are they pumping out too much power, and the equivalent of the pitch of the voice of that person in there, you can neglect everything that's of one pitch versus another. Now, we can't do this in the restaurant, so you're going to have to just
mm.
bear with me as the analogy breaks down. But
Yeah, like
imagine if you could.
different ways of filtering, I guess.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, but if you imagine that you could filter the soprano who is screaming and still have a conversation with a bass, well,
Mm,
you could do that. Um, Another thing that you can do is just look at the data itself. So we're not just passing just signals here. Inside of those signals is what are called chips and information about time. Well, often there are indicators inside of that data stream itself that it might not be quite right. Um, Things like the time signature, the timestamp is just a little bit off. And because our clocks are so precise, we can say, actually, is it really probable that I'm off by a microsecond? Actually, you know what? It's probably not right. My clock is better than that. So it's
mm,
probable that this microsecond, that 1/1000th of a second, is actually coming from a false signal. So again, these things are constantly changing, but there's just some basic kind of examples at each of those different layers of the things that we try to do to counter those different attacks.
mm. Wow, holy cow. So, I mean, these are all lessons that are being learned. And by the way, I loved how you said that you guys are what in constant beta or perpetual beta or something
Perpetual
like
beta.
that.
Yeah, that's
I
right. We
mean,
have never
I mean,
arrived.
that sounds like the right posture for today's modern battlefield. It really does. I mean, things are back to the episode with Bugsy, and I think you agree. Things are things are changing so rapidly that yeah, being in a perpetual beta is probably a good place to be. Um, uh, well, so maybe we could zoom back out or lateral over onto the societal side of things. But when GPS is hijacked, it's a security problem. What on on the commercial side are your clients and your customers saying about bad data, no data, GPS compromise, and so on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's important to us to make sure that these learnings apply to the whole of society, and it is, um, uh, quite pertinent in if you're a civilian today in Ukraine, you can't figure out on your phone where you are in the same way as you pull up Google Maps here. It simply will not work because there's so much spoofing and jamming. But from a commercial side, I think we need to parse a bit like you do, in your information arbitrage engine. Like, what is the difference between no data and bad data, right? So
Mm,
if you are an aircraft, for instance, and you suddenly have a data outage, okay, well, your aircraft is actually pretty decent at dealing with that. There's enough redundancy in those systems that it like, okay, well, I'm going to assume that my last heading was okay, and it's got fiber optic gyroscopes inside of it to help it maintain course, and it's relatively well set up to be able to navigate through storms and um, you know uh, various types, solar storms, earth
hmm
storms, what have you. That's not so bad. Again, so that's kind of like your jamming environment. You just assume that all the data is bad. Now, what the real thing that um, we're seeing that people struggle with, be it in industry or in defense, is quantifying how bad data is, right?
mm,
And let me give you just a brief example of what this could look like in a commercial environment, because we're seeing it in the defense environment today over the Russian Federation. If you have an autopilot that takes as gospel the height, the altitude reading that it's getting for that aircraft, and it says you have to maintain an altitude of, 30,000 feet, and you have a bit of spoofing data come in for that flight, and it convinces that aircraft that, oh, you're flying at 60,000 feet. What is that autopilot going to do? It's going to make a decision that says, oh, I need to lower my altitude. I need to come back to 30,000 feet because I'm way too high. I'm going to starve the engine. This is
mm,
going to be, it's
hmm
going to start nosing itself down, nosing itself down, nosing itself down. And if it just convinces it that it's 60,000 feet off, it will run itself directly into the ground,
hmm
right? And if you were to, for instance, do this at night over the South Pacific or South Atlantic, that pilot would have no visual indicator that he is about to send that aircraft directly into the ocean, right?
mm.
Because at night, he can't, the stars still look the same.
Yeah,
He,
yeah.
especially if it's a starless night, he can send that thing directly. You can, on autopilot, have that aircraft crash directly into the ground. And that is a direct analog for what we are seeing today inside of the Russian Federation, right?
Mm,
And it could
mm.
come to commercial aviation tomorrow. And that's what we want to make sure that folks are protected from.
Yeah, I mean that's a dramatic and realistic scenario for sure. Um, are there any other examples you could think of that might be a little bit more pedestrian?
Yeah, well, look, I'll give you my own personal aha moment here. John, was like a week and a half ago in Kiev. I was trying to use Uber, and I was trying to get picked up at one location and taken to another location, and I could not convince Uber that I was not in Peru. Try
Mm,
as I might, I could Like, what the heck is, I had to manually assign my position inside of Kyiv. And you know how hard it is for me to read, street signs in Cyrillic and try and jam those in? Like literally my more pedestrian problem was it took me nearly 15 minutes to get Uber ordered, because I couldn't find my way, I couldn't get Uber up and running. Right. And that
Hmm.
was a problem because it was negative 20 degrees and it was cold. Well,
Oh
that's a
my.
more pedestrian, slightly more less
Yeah.
dramatic example.
Yeah, but it's something that could affect a lot more people personally, potentially. But I'm curious. I mean, the spoofing was literally asserting that you were in Peru instead of
Correct.
Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm, I'm curious. I mean, no need to go look this up, but I'm curious if Peru is like precisely on the opposite side of the earth from Ukraine, and that the spoof was just to I don't know, change the longitude and latitude so that they were polar opposite of what they truly were, or something
It's
like that.
it's possible. I don't know. There's so many different varieties of spoofing that's why we've got to constantly adapt. But it's
Yeah.
possible that it was an
Hmm.
attack that reassigned satellite numbers and convinced it that, oh, okay, you're hailing from satellite 13 instead of satellite, 17, and that one happens to be that's plausible. That's a very plausible reason.
Interesting. Interesting. What about critical infrastructure? Do you have any thoughts about how this kind of a problem could manifest in a critical infrastructure context?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, away from the kind of banalities of um, my Uber, you know,
That's
power
critical
grids are.
infrastructure, transportation.
That's
There you
right. Well,
go.
that's right.
Yeah.
Um, Look, I mean, we even saw this, for instance, there's a real world example of this where there was a truck driver who I think was going past LaGuardia, and I'll have to look this up in my notes, but he wanted to be able to drive, I believe, for longer than his daily limit. And he knew that his trucking company was going to track his hours. So he
Hmm.
bought one of these cigarette lighter jammers, put it in his cigarette lighter, and twice per day he would run past LaGuardia, and LaGuardia would lose all of their GPS signal. You have to fact check me on that. I think the airport it might have been JFK or something like that, but just one cigarette lighter was able to mess up the GPS locations for an entire airport. Talk about critical infrastructure, right? Like if we had to put all the birds in America on the ground again in a hurry, like we did after 9/11, you know, and somebody had an intelligent coordinated attack where the intelligence was merely going and getting a bunch of cigarette lighter GPS jammers and plugging it in next to them like that.
You
That's
mean you mean like a small little like Radio Shack emitter
yes,
was able
yeah,
to obscure, tarnish the signals for a major airport hub?
metropolitan airport. Yes. Well, I
Wow.
mean, the problem here is that the wattage coming down is very, very fine. This comes down at 5 milliwatts. So let's be like super clear what that
Hmm.
is, right? So your average light bulb is probably 100 watts, right?
Hmm.
Now divide that by 100, you get down to one watt, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Divide that by a further 1,000 and then multiply by 5, and
Hmm.
that is the literal intensity that that little satellite is shining that out at, and it is extraordinarily easy to
Hmm.
overpower that. So
Hmm.
yeah, you can with a 12 volt with a 12
Hmm.
volt jack easily overpower all the GPS signals that are coming down in the vicinity of critical infrastructure like airports.
Wow. My goodness. Okay. Well, there you go. No kidding.
I don't want to tell the enemy how to do it. We've got other redundancy, by the way. The airport knows where it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
I'm not giving the bad guys
Okay.
a
Yeah.
legs up. The airport knows exactly where it is and exactly where the runway. And there's redundant
Hmm.
systems inside of aircraft that prevent aircraft from going off course on this. But yeah, that's a real thing um,
Yeah.
for airports.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Well, um, uh, I guess maybe just a little bit of like a sweep up question. You've mentioned a number of times that you've been in Ukraine recently on a number of different trips. What are some of the other lessons learned that you've gotten from being in the proximity of that war?
Yeah, so I mean, so many of them that again I can't deep dive onto here. But I think from my perspective, that lesson around um, we really need to learn from them right now is there. And um, just to give you a sense of the differential in manufacturing, again to quote General Petraeus on this one, he's quoting the number of about 300,000 drones being made in America this year for defense. The Ukrainians are making 7 million of them.
Mm.
Okay, so more than a order of magnitude more, and through that come a lot of lessons, and I think we would be wise to learn from what they're doing. So that's a big one. Quantity has a quality all its own. Another bit, and this is really for all of society here. What's really inspirational is watching folks who were farmers or local professors or local professionals step into military service and add their brain power to that. That's why I'm really impressed with what you're doing here at IPA as well, and making it a broad community. I think the more cross-functional and cross-disciplinary eyes we can get on this, the better off that we'll be, because there are going to be people who think about what I just said, who are going to think about implications well beyond what I'm talking about. There's going to be a guy who runs the power grid who thinks, oh, you know what? I use GPS timing for this power grid, and if it gets out of phase, I'm going to blow up transformers, right? Um, you know, I think the final bit is, and this is tied to the second one, is just the speed of innovation, and it is remarkable. They're working in weekly development cycles, and we're still running a defense department that is at its best of times setting out quadrennial defense reviews, right, and setting
Mm.
requirements in that way. And it's just we've got to quickly change the way that we're doing defense procurement in this area, just like you're thinking about it much more fast in the realm of influence.
Well, information related capabilities, on average tend to be, just pennies on the dollar compared to, the major hardware, maritime platforms, which are also necessary. But is drone technology, would you say, adjacent to information related capabilities in terms of cost, relatively inexpensive, but asymmetric effects?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're seeing from Ukraine. I think the assumption has been in the U.S. that there's going to, and Bugsy talked about this, right? The
Hmm.
assumption in
Hmm.
the U.S. is that we're going to have these giant, exquisite systems like Tomahawk missiles, which are, I think, 2 million a pop, and that they're going to be the only thing that work. Well, the Ukrainians are launching this stuff for 50 grand, and they have roughly the same capabilities. And in some cases, they have better capabilities than ours do, if I'm quite honest. And yeah, they're developing very, very quickly, and it's great to see that Secretary Hegseth has changed the classification of drones to allow units to be purchased by basically on your government charge card. But
Hmm.
um, what we still need is leadership that says, okay, it's cool that you've got your race car drone, your first person viewer drone, but we still need to figure out how does this integrate at a higher level of command. You can't take a first person viewer Radio Shack drone and fly it 40 clicks. It just won't do it. It doesn't have the battery power, right? So you've still got to figure out how to make that next echelon work, and you've still got to have real intelligent wargaming at operational and strategic levels that look at this problem, and they need to be able to move as quickly as those first person viewer drones.
Hmm. Um, how do you guys at your outfit, um, Advanced Navigation, how does your engineering team, get after it? What does that look like?
Yeah, so look, I'm maybe biased, but I think I've got the best team in the outfit. Everybody believes that, right? But my engineers go directly on site with our customers. So I've had my guys out in Ukraine. I've had them out
Is that right?
in
Yeah.
Apex. I've had them out in Pentax. I've had them, and I can speak with some level of authority when I can say, "Hey, look, we are speculating about what near peer adversaries might be able to do in this area versus what is actually happening. And the sophistication of attacks is totally different. But we tend to go and try and partner very deeply with a company who's really got a really knotty problem that's really going to push the edge of what we're doing. And then we try and take the lessons from that and spread them out to everybody in the field. So I can't go into details on which exact companies we're working with in different areas, but that's our approach is to try and stay abreast by working on the specific problems that we're running to. Again, it just echoes General Petraeus's note about playing the Super Bowl every day.
How do you guys look at integration with adjacent platforms or interoperability on the battlefield?
Yeah, look, that's a core of what my team works on. It is, I mean, much like in your own startup experience here, John, you add value at different portions of it, and different customers are going to want different things. The Europeans are going to want a slightly different. For instance, they don't even call it GPS. It's Galileo in GPS. They have their own satellite constellation. All right, so we got to figure out how to make that work. We got to be agnostic to that. We've got to be agnostic to, different components of the modular open systems approach that are taken by European allies versus the U.S. And then inside the U.S., obviously, Marine Corps and Army can never agree on these kinds of things. So, systems integration is always a challenge. But again, that's a big component of what my team ends up doing, is trying to translate those standards and make sure that it's as easy as possible at the end to still get the best individual solution.
Right. Well, I mean, everything you've been describing can clearly be articulated in terms of like an arms race, where the bad guys innovate, the good guys respond to the innovation, and so on it goes. But how do you foresee getting to the point where the defenders have the advantage and are not necessarily responding to the attack innovation, if you get my question?
Yeah. No, I get exactly what you're saying, right? We used to talk about, on active duty, John and I, the primacy of the defense, right? Like it takes 3 times the number of folks on the offense to overcome the defense, because once you're dug in into a fighting hole, right, like it's very difficult to overrun that machine gun. Well, I think from my perspective, just like you were saying before, John, this is a mindset shift. Just like other components of the cognitive war require you to adapt really quickly, we've got to take the same thing here. So when my first job in the Marine Corps was a field radio operator, right?
I had forgotten you. Yeah, you've shared that with me before. I'd forgotten
Yeah,
that.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I was an
right. Yeah,
enlisted field radio operator,
yeah.
and
Motivator. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. And we were still using Crazy Tens, a little add-on to a HF radio from Vietnam to be able to backfill cryptographic information on top of this thing. So it was able to send data. We had a physical other unit attached to a plain text unit in order to be able to send this stuff cryptographically. The PRIC 119's got a little bit better. We were able to at least put it inside the device. But overall, it was nearly 30 years, and we were still using the same hardware. And I think that's reality. Hardware is just going to move a lot slower than software. But what we have since done is we have talked about software-defined radios, right? We should be able to make it super easy for that infantryman on the ground to quickly switch channels if one is blocked. They should be able to hot fill their timing. I think we're gonna have to get to the same point with signals data as we do with radio data. That S6, who has that communications electronic operating instruction in that 5-paragraph order, is going to have to get used to, okay, here is the data that you need to fill to be able to prevent spoofing and jamming today. It is based on learnings that we had last week. If you do not move that fast, you will be susceptible to attacks, because that's how quickly the attacks are evolving in the Russian Federation, right? And that's what a near peer adversary actually looks like. fighting this. We got a little bit fat and happy in Iraq and Afghanistan, believing that, oh, well, it's impervious, but a near peer adversary can do lots of clever things. And we're going to have to adapt at the speed of software, at the speed of information. And it's going to require us to change the way we think about procurement. Right now, we think about GPS as a thing. You talk about your GPS as if it's a physical device, but it is actually an information device. And you're going to have to change. We're going to have to change the way we deal with it.
Yeah, 100%. What's it like leading your team? So you've got a whole bunch of veterans and civilian, former civilian government employees as well. What's it like leading the group of folks like that?
Look, it's a privilege. I mean, it's great. I've got team members in the United Kingdom, in the US, here in Australia, and the insights we're able to get are it's exciting because you can see the way the Australians are trying to attack this problem versus the way that the US is trying to attack this problem versus the way that they're running exercises in Norway, and having the different defense experiences that those folks have and the different clearances they have to try and feed the best data in is great. And I appreciate you soft pitching me this question, John, because I don't want to ever miss a moment to praise my team. They are some of the smartest engineers I've ever worked with, and I say that with some authority based on some of the time I spent at Google, where we also had some very smart engineers, and they are willing to go into out of the way places. It's just a privilege to be able to lead them, to be honest with you,
Well,
or keep up with them, as the case may be.
Sure. Yeah, I get it. You guys are headquartered out of Australia. Is that right? But you've got a
That's right.
global team footprint.
That's right. Yeah. So we've got a British entity and a US entity right now, and we're standing up more manufacturing in those areas. More plans to be announced shortly, but yes, we are becoming a more global company every day.
This has been dynamite, Doug, as I knew it would. And I mean, we have lots of dynamite discussions, in my opinion, on the podcast, but this has the kind of the double hit of being a really interesting topic and a vivid, like now kind of a topic for the national security community. I'd like to maybe just start wrapping up a little bit and ask, if you could look into your crystal ball, what is the future for this problem space and the kind of technology that needs to keep a pace?
Yeah. So look, from my perspective, the future is kind of like Swiss cheese. It's kind of
Okay.
maneuver warfare, so to speak, of navigation data. So what I mean by Swiss cheese, I'm the chair of the board of a small manufacturing company that gives vets and refugees and asylum seekers their first jobs. And our head of safety always talks about the Swiss cheese model of safety. And what he means is, if you took a block of Swiss cheese and you cut it up into a bunch of slices and you rotated those all at 90 degrees to each other, well, it's only when you could take a pencil and send it through all of those things in the Swiss cheese at once that you have a safety incident. So you don't get somebody real close to a machine that has a spinning saw on it. You make sure that they've got some physical barriers there. You make sure they've got some visual cues as well, that it's painted nice and red, that they have a safety briefing in the morning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all these things on the way through. I think it's the same thing for navigation, right?
Hmm.
We believe that inertial navigation, because it's so difficult to spoof it, jam it, it doesn't depend on anything outside of it, is probably going to be a really big barrier to getting bad data in. But it's not the only thing, right? And from our perspective, you're still going to need satellite data of some type, or you're still probably going to want it. You're probably going to want magnetic data. Again, it's the Earth has a magnetic core. That's useful, all right? You don't want to disregard that. Maybe there's folks in the quantum space who are going to get this up to a higher readiness level, and we can start using quantum magnetometers and things like that. So our view is, when you fuse all this together, you can get a really solid picture of where you're at, where you're pointing, what time it is, answer some of those really simple questions, or those straightforward questions to ask, that are really critical for the battlefield. So I think that's the future model, is a Swiss cheese model.
Wow. Well, maybe perhaps with the exception of the Ukrainians, is anybody ready for today's modern battlefield, especially in the context of this discussion?
No, I'm seeing the Europeans are really taking it very seriously. Programs like Break Stop in the United Kingdom, others are really leaning in, and they see it because they feel imminently how close the Russian Federation is. They're trying
What is
to catch up.
what what is break stop?
Oh,
Sorry to.
it's basically it's trying to basically replicate. We have something called the Replicator program in the U.S. that tries to take some of the learnings out of the Ukraine and build it in the
Hmm.
U.S. and in the U.K. So there's an effort on, but my impression is it's still not fast enough,
Hmm.
not based on the development cycles I'm seeing. That we're perhaps not as bad as fighting today's war with last war's weapons, but you know we're still behind. And unfortunately, no, I wish I could give you a happy picture that somebody's
Hmm.
cracked the code and we've got defense procurement up and it's ready to move at the speed of information. But no, it's not there yet in any country that I can see.
Right. And by the way, I've got one more question. But you mentioned a nonprofit that you're involved with that helps with what did you say again with um,
So we've
immigration?
given yeah, we've given veterans, refugees, asylum
Uh-huh.
seekers their first jobs in Australia. It springs out of a bit of my
Yeah.
experience in Afghanistan and Haiti.
What i- what is that? And okay, is there a way for people to find out more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's my passion. That's my other passion project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go to pgpurpose.org is the name of the not-for-profit. We have a little manufacturing company that makes paper tubes of all things
Hmm.
down in Melbourne. And yeah, my conviction is I wasn't smart enough to be born enough in Wisconsin. I just got lucky. So, if
Okay.
other folks just happen to not want to be born in South Helmand province, where, we both spent some time, and they want to, get up and find their way to another place, then we should give them a fair crack at that if they get a chance to do it. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Excellent.
That's my
Excellent.
other passion project.
Excellent. What does the P and G mean?
Purpose and growth is what it stands for.
Purpose and growth. Okay. Well, we'll have a link to that in the show notes, and if anybody, if that is in anybody's, uh, 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 interest space, check it out and contact Doug if you'd like to lend a hand. I'm sure there is opportunity. So I meant to ask that after you mentioned it. So, but last thing I wanted to ask, what's the practical advice that you give to the young enlisted service member or young officer who's just joining or has only been in a year or two? What kind of advice do you have for them, especially related to today's discussion?
Yeah, look, so I think there was a good video put out at the end of last year that showed a young Marine pulling out his cell phone and doing something as simple as getting on and messaging somebody else, and then a bunch of bad actors coming in and finding out where he was. I think that is necessary but insufficient, right? The concerns that we have around emissions control um, are real, and it's possible to pinpoint where Russians who have bad IMCON are right next to the front line. Um, I I think they need to take. It is imperative that the next generation understand that information has physical effects. Okay, your information that you emit out of your phone, the information that you take in, has real world physical effects. Okay, I'm talking about just one slice of that today in terms of data for position, navigation, and timing, but the other stuff that you talk about here at IPA is critical. Right? I think if there was one other lesson I would give them is it, don't neglect your class about the 1 to 50,000 and a lensatic compass, right? If
Mm,
we can't
mm,
figure this
mm.
out, that stuff that they learned at School of Infantry and at the Infantry Officers Course and at TBS is going to be really critical really quickly. And you better understand your catching features and your all those fun things that we learned, because you
Yep.
can't drag dinosaurs like me and John back as the only
Yep.
guys who know how to do this
Yeah.
anymore.
Know the difference between a concave slope, a convex slope, and
That's right. That's right.
things
If we
like
don't
this.
figure this out, you're gonna have to get used to using a map again, a map and a
Yeah.
compass.
Yeah. The contour lines are really close together. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Look out for
Yeah.
that cliff.
Yeah. Well, just a little bit of levity in what's otherwise a very important and serious topic. Wrapping up, Doug, what's a good research topic that someone could take a crack at to help advance necessary innovation in this problem space?
Yeah, look, so from my perspective, there's a lot of really interesting theoretical work that goes out there. I mean, we're seeing a lot again in the quantum space. We're seeing a lot with satellites and stuff. I think balancing the commercial realities of needing to have a device process at the very edge of the battlefield robustly a bunch of signals and come up with a intelligent solution, with some novel data source is going to be the coup de grace here. So if you can, for instance, there's plans to be able to throw up low Earth orbit satellites over top of Marines and soldiers in the next conflict. We'll just launch them right away to be able to get us the communications bandwidth we need in case Starlink gets shot out of the sky, what have you. Right? Fine, great. That's emitting a signal. Can we use that to triangulate our position if the Chinese take out GPS, for instance? Could we use something else to figure out our solution? Can we do that dynamically on the fly? And can you do that? And this is the real engineering part, not just the research part. Can you do that in an Edison mindset? Edison always kept track of what the costs were of his light bulbs. He knew he needed to beat the cost of a candle. It's fine if you can show this on a beautiful whiteboard and you can show all the equations, great, that's awesome. If you can't solve that on a processor that is alone and unafraid at the edge of the battle space, then it's a paperweight, right? So from my perspective, that translating that unique physics knowledge and turning it into something that works with it can be fused at the edge of the battle space on low computation power that would be a great topic. Whoever's working on that, we want to know who you are. Send an email to us at Advanced Navigation, and we want you to come work with us. That's all.
Right. Quantum too, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great
There's a whole quantum direction of this problem space too. I understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We think quantum is super interesting and are working with a bunch of companies on it, but we struggle with this practicality problem. And we can't get our sensors near the edge of the battlefield down to near absolute zero. We
Yep.
also can't pump them
Not
with a
there
bunch
yet.
of power. We can't, so
Yep.
we've got to get practical about what can a warfighter actually carry. There's going to be some solutions where that works fine. That's great, but we're going to have to find some engineering solutions to get these things more robust and combat ready.
Right. And I know everybody is just waiting. Doug, what can I go get from the library or from some other source? Where can I really geek out? Other than contacting you on LinkedIn and geeking out, where else can I get some really good, interesting information about this problem space?
Yeah, look, if you really want to go deep on it, it's a textbook. It's dense, but it covers a lot of this. It's global navigation, satellite systems, inertial navigation, and integration. Okay, it's a few hundred pages, lots of math equations. It isn't too bad, though. I would encourage folks, if you want to get into this space, to read through that as an initial primer.
Okay. All right. Well, that was just a gallop across this emerging, real and emerging problem of the new fog of war. And with that, Doug Abdiel, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.